December 23, 1944, Camp Huntsville, Texas. The mesquite smoke curled skyward into the cold night air, carrying with it the scent of hickory and rebellion. Beyond the barbed wire, a fire crackled like distant artillery. But the men gathered around it weren't preparing for battle. They were sharing a meal that could end careers, destroy reputations, and violate every regulation in the United States Army Handbook. German prisoners of war sat shoulder to shoulder with American guards, laughing, passing cornbread, trading cigarettes under a sky heavy with stars and secrets. Someone strummed a guitar, someone else uncorked a bottle, and standing at the center of it all, flipping ribs over open flame with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was risking, was Corporal Earl McCafferty. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story of unlikely brotherhood and wartime courage, hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on more untold stories from history. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Earl knew what he was doing. Article 13 of the U.S. Military Conduct Code was crystal clear. Fraternization with prisoners of war was strictly forbidden. Feeding them was one thing. Eating with them, sharing music, laughter, and humanity across the wire, that was treason in uniform. If headquarters found out, he'd be court-martialed before sunrise. But Earl had spent too many nights watching hollow-eyed German boys shovel tasteless rations into their mouths like animals at a trough. Too many mornings hearing the same cold line from his superiors. They're the enemy, not dinner guests. Now, in the glow of the fire, he watched them eat like men for the first time in years. No ranks, no flags, just hunger meeting gratitude. One of the prisoners, Friedrich Keller, a Luftwaffe mechanic from Munich, lowered his plate and whispered to the man beside him in German, "In my country, this would be treason." His voice trembled. A soldier eating with his enemy. Earl caught the words, understood enough from the tone. He smiled and said in his slow Texas drawl, "Well, son, this is just barbecue, and in Texas, we don't have enemies at supper time." And in that moment, under the smoke and stars, the war stopped. Not officially, not legally, but in the hearts of the men around that fire, it ceased to exist. Camp Huntsville sat quiet under the flat Texas sun. A sprawling grid of wooden barracks, watchtowers, and barbed wire stretched across several thousand acres of pine forest and prairie. To a passing rancher, it looked like a cattle yard. To the 4,800 German prisoners of war housed inside, it was a paradox wrapped in confusion. These men had been told that capture by Americans meant starvation, torture, or execution. Instead, they found bunks with clean sheets, showers with running water, and guards who said, "Yes, sir," even to prisoners. By 1944, the United States held more than 400,000 Axis prisoners across hundreds of camps scattered through the rural heartland: Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. The irony wasn't lost on the Germans. They had crossed oceans to fight the industrial might of America and ended up hoeing cotton beside the very machines that had crushed their armies. They worked the fields under a sun that never seemed to set, harvesting crops that would feed the nation that defeated them. And yet, in those fields, something unexpected happened. The walls between enemy and neighbor began to crack. Corporal Earl McCafferty was not built for war. He'd been drafted out of Amarillo in 1942, leaving behind a small cattle ranch, a tired mother, and a lifetime of hard, honest work under the Texas sky. The Army made him a cook because, as his sergeant joked, "You can feed a man or kill him. Pick one." Earl chose feeding. He'd seen hunger up close during the Dust Bowl years, watched it hollow out good men, turn them bitter and mean. Every time he ladled thin soup into a prisoner's dented tin cup, something inside him twisted. The rules were clear. Guards were to maintain strict discipline and never treat prisoners as equals. Posters in the barracks warned, no fraternization, no personal contact, no exceptions. The fear was that kindness would weaken discipline, that sympathy would breed disorder. But the reality of Texas was different. The German prisoners picked cotton for local farms, repaired fences, fixed tractors, and worked side by side with Texans who sometimes forgot, or chose to forget, that these young men were the enemy. Cowboys taught them how to rope cattle. Farmers shared water in the fields during the brutal summer heat, and when one prisoner collapsed from heat exhaustion, a rancher gave him his hat and said, "Keep it, son. You'll need it more than me." Earl saw that moment and never forgot it. "If that ain't America," he muttered to himself, "I don't know what is." Still, the official tone remained rigid. Officers reminded guards weekly, maintain distance, enforce hierarchy, remember who won and who lost. But Texas had its own ideas about war and mercy. To the men of the plains, freedom wasn't something you guarded jealously. It was something you gave away, knowing it would come back stronger. When Friedrich Keller first saw the American cook in his stained apron and sweat-soaked shirt, he didn't see a soldier. He saw a man with sunburnt skin and eyes that carried both weariness and quiet humor. Earl wasn't the kind of man who saluted or barked orders. He just worked, cleaned pots, and cooked. And that, more than any propaganda leaflet or interrogation, broke Friedrich's expectations. "Americans fight hard," he wrote in a smuggled letter home, "but they live soft. Their kindness frightens me more than their bombs." The German prisoners of Camp Huntsville lived in a strange balance between discipline and disbelief. They wore khaki work clothes instead of uniforms, marched to farm trucks under the morning sun, and sang old folk songs softly in the backs of cotton fields. Every day followed the same rhythm: sunrise, labor, mess call, silence. But beneath the calm surface was confusion. How could their enemy, the decadent, materialistic Americans, treat them better than their own officers ever had? Friedrich Keller felt this contradiction more than most. At 26, he had survived North Africa, Sicily, and the chaos of Normandy before being captured when his convoy ran out of fuel outside Cherbourg. Back home, he'd been told that surrender meant dishonor. In the Reich's newspapers, American camps were painted as brutal places where prisoners were worked to death. But here he was in Texas, watching guards joke with local ranchers and hearing the distant echo of country music drifting through the pine trees at night. Friedrich didn't trust it at first. He kept his head down, avoided eye contact, and followed every rule with German precision. Yet one morning, when his work detail returned from the fields, he saw Earl standing beside a pickup truck loaded with crates of vegetables and fresh meat. Earl handed a cold canteen to the nearest prisoner and said, "You all look beat. Drink up." No sneer, no hesitation, just casual decency. Friedrich hesitated before taking the canteen. "Danke," he muttered. Earl grinned. "You're welcome, Fritz." The Germans laughed nervously, unsure if it was mockery. But Earl's tone carried no cruelty. He looked like a man who'd never met a war he didn't want to fix with food. Later that day, Friedrich saw him again, frying eggs in a skillet that hissed over a hot stove. The smell made his stomach ache with longing. The rations were decent: bread, beans, stew, but nothing like this. Earl caught his glance and shrugged. "Ain't for y'all today, but maybe one day." Friedrich didn't know what to make of that. Inside the barracks, talk spread like wildfire. Some prisoners claimed Earl was secretly sympathetic to Germany. Others said he'd grown up poor and couldn't stand to see anyone hungry. Whatever the reason, he was different. And that difference made the camp feel less like a prison and more like purgatory, a place suspended between guilt and grace. When mail arrived, most letters were censored. Still, Friedrich wrote to his younger brother, hiding hope between the lines. "The Americans fight cleanly. They feed us well. They have machines that never stop. But it is their people who confuse me most. They smile even at prisoners. They share cigarettes. It is unsettling." As the months passed, the rhythm of camp life dulled the edges of war. Some prisoners began carving wooden toys or painting watercolor landscapes of the Texas plains. Others volunteered to work extra hours just to leave the fence for a few more minutes. And through it all, Earl kept cooking. Eggs in the morning, stew at noon, cornbread when he could get it. He said little, smiled often, and watched quietly as the Germans' walls began to crumble. Not the fences around them, but the ones inside. By the fall of 1944, the war in Europe had turned desperate, but Camp Huntsville remained a strange island of calm. The German prisoners picked cotton, repaired tractors, and built fences, unaware of how close their homeland was to ruin. To the Americans who guarded them, it was just another post in the middle of nowhere. To men like Earl McCafferty, it had become a test of conscience. One morning, a new bulletin arrived from the War Department. It reinforced the same standing order every guard already knew: no fraternization, no personal contact, no shared meals. The paper was tacked to the mess hall wall, a constant reminder that compassion could be considered misconduct. Earl read it while stirring a pot of beans. "Ain't that something?" he muttered. "Feeding a man's now a crime." His friend, Sergeant Hal Dawson, smirked and said, "Yeah, well, rules are rules, Earl. Don't get yourself court-martialed over kindness." Earl didn't reply. He just kept stirring. That same week, a work detail returned from a local ranch late, sunburnt and exhausted. Among them was Friedrich Keller. During the day, one of the guard's horses had stepped into a gopher hole and nearly broken its leg. Friedrich, once a mechanic for Luftwaffe ground vehicles, had acted fast, using rope and a splint to stabilize the animal. The guard swore that without him, the horse would have been shot. When the story reached Earl, he didn't see an enemy doing his job. He saw a man showing mercy to a helpless creature. "That German's got more decency than half the fellas I know," he said quietly. That night, the mess hall was almost empty. The prisoners ate in silence, their tin trays clattering softly. Earl ladled the last of the soup and watched Friedrich eat slow and weary. He thought about that bulletin on the wall, about the tired faces across the fence, and about the upcoming holidays. Thanksgiving was weeks away, Christmas just beyond that. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Back home, his mother used to say, "If God gives you food, you share it. That's how you earn your blessings." The Army said otherwise, but Texas had its own laws, older than Washington's. That night, Earl sat on the steps of the mess hall staring at the horizon. "You ever notice," he said to Dawson, who had joined him for a smoke, "how these fellas don't talk hate anymore? They just work, eat, and look like they're waiting for someone to remind them they're human." Dawson exhaled slowly. "They're the enemy, Earl." "Maybe," Earl said, lighting another match. "But a hungry man's just a man. You give him food and you got peace for a while." The wind carried the scent of smoke and mesquite. Earl flicked the match into the dirt and smiled to himself. He'd made his decision. Orders or not, there would be a feast. Not a celebration of victory or defeat, but a reminder that decency was still possible. Earl McCafferty's plan began the way most Texas legends do, with a simple idea, a few trusted friends, and a complete disregard for the rules. The seed had been growing in his mind for weeks. He'd watched the prisoners haul lumber, mend fences, and sweat through the long autumn days, their faces hollow and eyes distant. Christmas was coming, and though no one said it aloud, the loneliness in the camp was as thick as the dust. The official menus were meager: beans, hard bread, sometimes a scrap of meat if supply lines held. But Earl wasn't interested in official. He wanted something real, something that would make those boys forget the wire for one night. He started small. A quiet word with the local ranchers who supplied the camp. "You got any scraps of beef laying around?" he'd ask. Some looked at him funny. Others smiled and said nothing. Texans knew how to keep a secret when it mattered. Within a few days, boxes of smoked brisket, fresh vegetables, and even a jug or two of cider began appearing at the back door of the mess hall, miscounted on delivery logs. Earl also needed help. He turned to Sergeant Hal Dawson and Private Ray Wilcox, men he trusted not to run their mouths. When Earl told them the plan, Dawson nearly dropped his cigarette. "Earl, that's fraternization. They'll hang us up by our bootstraps if the major finds out." "Then we don't let him find out," Earl said calmly. "We'll say we're feeding the work detail late. Just keep it quiet." Wilcox, the youngest of the three, grinned. "If you're cooking your brisket, I'll take the risk. The three men began preparing in secret. They cleaned the old fire pit behind the mess hall, gathered dry mesquite wood, and borrowed a few tin plates from supply. Earl even convinced one of the guards' wives in town to bake cornbread and hide it in a laundry delivery. Every piece of the plan carried risk, but also purpose. On the other side of the fence, Friedrich Keller sensed something unusual. The guards seemed less tense, their whispers livelier. The smell of real meat drifted through camp that afternoon, thicker and sweeter than the usual boiled beans. One of the older prisoners, an ex-cook from Hamburg, sniffed the air and muttered, "That's hickory smoke. Someone's cooking a feast." By sunset, Earl's plan was in motion. The fire pit glowed orange, sparks rising into the Texas dusk. Tables were dragged from the storage shed. The guards gathered in a loose circle pretending to inspect equipment, and Earl, with his sleeves rolled and his face slick with sweat, tended the grill like a man on a mission. Inside the camp, the prisoners watched. Confusion gave way to curiosity. When one of the guards unlocked the gate and motioned them over, silence fell across the yard. Friedrich hesitated, then stepped forward. "Is this permitted?" he asked in broken English. Earl looked up from the fire and smiled. "Not a bit," he said. "Now grab a plate before I change my mind." The Texas night arrived soft and cool, the horizon burning with the last light of the sun as the German prisoners stepped hesitantly toward the fire pit. They had no idea what to expect. Some thought it was a trick. Others feared it was some strange form of interrogation. But when they saw the tables covered in food, smoked beef, cornbread, potatoes glistening with butter, they froze. Friedrich Keller stood near the front of the group, still in disbelief. He looked at Earl McCafferty, who was flipping slices of brisket with a pair of tongs. The smoke carried that deep, sweet scent of hickory and fat that reminded Friedrich of home, of Sunday roasts before the war. His throat tightened. Earl wiped his hands on his apron and said, "Ain't no tricks here, fellas. It's Christmas Eve. Y'all have been working hard, and my mama would haunt me if I let a man go hungry tonight." One of the German officers, Lieutenant Weber, tried to protest. "It is forbidden to fraternize," he said stiffly. "We are prisoners. We cannot accept." Earl raised an eyebrow. "Then don't think of it as fraternizing. Think of it as eating. I'm cooking, that's all." A few guards chuckled quietly, breaking the tension. Someone passed out tin plates, and the first brave prisoner, an older man with gray hair and trembling hands, stepped forward. He took a piece of cornbread, then another, and muttered in broken English, "Danke." Earl nodded. "Don't thank me. Thank Texas." The others followed, slowly at first, then all at once. The air filled with voices, German and English mixing, laughter hesitant at first, then real. The guards stood nearby, rifles slung but hands relaxed. No one issued orders. No one barked commands. For one night the war seemed far away, drowned in the sound of sizzling meat and quiet conversation. When Friedrich finally sat down with his plate, he stared at the food as if it were unreal. The last time he'd tasted anything like this had been before North Africa, before the endless rations and desert hunger. He took a bite of bacon, and the salt, smoke, and fat hit him like a memory. His eyes burned, but not from the fire. Across from him, Earl sat cross-legged with his own plate, tearing bread with his hands. "You know," he said, "my granddaddy used to say a good meal is worth more than a sermon." Friedrich smiled faintly. "Your grandfather was a wise man." "Nah," Earl said, "just hungry most of his life." The laughter that followed was small but real. Even the guards joined in. That night they shared not just food but stories, clumsy attempts at translation, gestures, laughter. One prisoner showed a picture of his wife. A guard pulled out a photograph of his own kids. They compared them in silence. Two fathers who suddenly each other without words.